Welcome to the Orchestrate All the Things podcast. I'm George Anadiotis and we'll be connecting the dots together.
Trying to capture the value open source software generates can be a bit chaotic. The CHAOSS project may lend a helping hand. By now, the tension between commercial interests and open source projects is well known. Trying to balance building a sustainable business and a community around open source software in a cloud-first world is not the easiest thing in the world. In the latest episodes of a long-winding saga, two more commercial open source vendors, Elastic and Grafana, changed their licenses. The rationale was clearly communicated as trying to protect the businesses they have built around the respective open source projects from cloud vendors that they feel compete unfairly with them without contributing as much as they do. Interestingly, all parties involved refer to the community as being front and center in what they do. While obviously important, however, what constitutes an open source community, how it's faring, and what value it generates all seem rather vaguely defined. The people working in the CHAOSS project under the auspices of the Linux Foundation want to change that. We caught up with Georg Link, CHAOSS project co-founder, to find out more.
I hope you will enjoy the podcast. If you like my work, you can follow Link Data Orchestration on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook.
So right, a good way to start the conversation, and for the benefit of people who may be listening, would be to ask you to say a few words about yourself and actually the topic of the conversation, which is the CHAOSS project. And actually, that's that's a little question to start with. I wonder if I'm pronouncing it right, because that's what it looks like, but maybe you know better. No.
Yes, CHAOSS is the correct way to pronounce it, the CHAOSS
Okay.
project.
Mm-hmm.
It is short for Community Health Analytics Open Source Software. And the goal of the CHAOSS project is to bring together industry professionals, academics, and anyone else who has an interest in understanding the health of open source communities and using metrics to understand how healthy communities are. So putting some numbers to this understanding and having that transparency.
Okay.
And so for my background, I'm originally from Germany. I grew up there. Fun fact, I grew up on the 800-year-old castle. Not in the castle, but on the premise of the castle.
Mm-hmm.
And after high school, I did an apprenticeship in a bank. I earned a bachelor's alongside with a focus on financial services, business administration. And then I went on to a master's degree in management information systems. I had the opportunity to go on an exchange program to Omaha, Nebraska, where I earned an MBA. The credits transferred seamlessly between the programs, but I fell in love here in Omaha, Nebraska, and so I still live here. I came back to earn a PhD in information technology, and this is where the current research focus on corporate engagement and open source community health led to starting the CHAOSS project. So today I co-lead the CHAOSS project. I'm a director of sales at Biturgia. I teach courses on open source communities at Brandeis University, and I lead the IEEE SA Open Community Advisory Group.
Okay, well, that's a lot to manage, and you sound like you have a busy schedule for sure. And for me personally, the first time I came across the project was, I guess, a few months or maybe a year back. But I've been a long time proponent of open source, and I'm a user. I sporadically contribute, and I'm also very much interested, and my writing revolves around data, metrics, analytics, and all those things. So the CHAOSS project is, I would say, at the confluence of those two things. So I kind of naturally gravitated towards that. And before I expand on mentioning the specific context that attracted me, maybe it's interesting to, if you can share a few words about the background of the project itself. So when was it initiated? Who were the first people that got involved? I should also mention that it's under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation. So I wonder, what the
Correct.
exact relationship there is, if you can mention that.
Yeah, correct. The CHAOSS project is a Linux Foundation project, and the roots go back like 15 years with a research team in Madrid, Spain, at the University of Juan Carlos, who was trying to understand how software is being built in open source. And they didn't have any tooling for that was open source. So they built their own, open sourced it. And this is the Grimoire lab tools. And they were building a community around this. 8 years ago, they started Biturgia as a company to provide services because the interest was pretty big to understand how open source communities work. And then a couple of years ago, they approached the Linux Foundation to move their Grimoire Lab open source project under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation. At the same time, this is where I come in. We were researching community health at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And we went to the Open Source Leadership Summit, which is the annual Linux Foundation member summit now. And in the spur of a moment, we put up, hey, let's talk about community health as an unconference session. And the interest was so big, we had to pull in chairs from other rooms. And so after that session, we talked with the Linux Foundation and that, hey, your members are interested in this, we're interested in this, can we continue the conversation? And they said yes, and we also have Biturgia, and we have this tool. Biturgia was providing metrics to the Linux Foundation already. So yeah, let's bring this conversation together. And that's how we started the CHAOSS project in 2017. So 4 years ago. And then it was officially announced at the Open Source Summit North America with Jim Zemlin on the big stage calling out that, hey, community health is important. And now we have the CHAOSS project.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's interesting. And yeah, it sounds like you have captured some momentum there, all right. And just quickly browsing through publicly available material, like things you have on GitHub and the project website, I saw a few names actually there, and yeah, I'll be honest with you, I didn't actually do the work of tracing back each and every one of those names, but it seems like there's a number of people involved. So, and you already mentioned the connection with the Linux Foundation. So I wonder, plus the fact that there is Biturgia, which is, in my understanding, a commercial entity, which is also involved. So I wonder if what the model is for the project, basically. So is it in some way sponsored by the Linux Foundation? Do the people who contribute work independently and are paid for, by the organizations they work for? Are some people at least full-time on with the project? So how does it all work?
The CHAOSS project, as all Linux Foundation projects, has a project charter. And in the project charter, it says it's an unfunded project. So there is no money that members pay to be part of the project, unlike other Linux Foundation projects. And so we rely on donations, on securing sponsorships to like run events and do other things. The members involved in the CHAOSS project come from a variety of different companies, foundations. From over the years, we had Mozilla, Eclipse, Linux Foundation. At our events, we had Software Freedom Conservancy, Open Source Initiative. We have different companies from Google, GitLab, Red Hat, VMware. The list is pretty long. We have in our metrics release, so one of the things we do is we define metrics. We list 160 contributors who have helped shape the definition of these metrics. And on a weekly basis, we have about 30 to 40 active members. And we have currently sponsorship from the Sloan Foundation. This is through the University of Nebraska at Omaha and University of Missouri. Matt Germonprez and Sean Goggins, who I was working with doing my PhD, have this grant that allows them to be dedicated to the CHAOSS project. It also funded the community manager, Elizabeth Barron, who is amazing. We love her. And we also have sponsorship from the Sustain OSS group for our podcast.
Okay. Yeah, I did notice you have a podcast and you also seem to be having an active community. So I guess both the sponsorship and the work of Elizabeth, whom you mentioned, kind of so. And the other thing I noticed just by browsing around your material is that, well, it looks quite diverse and also quite well organized. So you have different working groups. You have software that you produce. You already mentioned in your initial introduction to how the project got started, the Grimoire software. You have lots of activities, such as the podcast, for example. So I wonder if you can quickly mention what the working groups are, because I think these are pretty interesting in understanding, and we're going to get to that, the specific metrics that you devise. You have divided them in areas and you have assigned a work group to each of these areas. So if you would like to introduce those by starting with the different work groups.
The CHAOSS project is, we're doing two things in parallel. One thing is we built software for metrics, and the other thing is we define metrics. And we do those in parallel because they inform each other. As we are coming up with new ideas for metrics, we can prototype them in software, build them out. And then also as we are building them out, we learn about the feasibility of metrics, what else we can do, get feedback from people, and then we improve our metric definition. When we started the project, we had 4 software projects. One is the Grimoire Lab project, which was donated by Biturgia, and still to this day, Biturgia is the core maintainer behind this project. And so to your earlier question, there are employees of Biturgia who work full-time on the Grimoire Lab project. Mm-hmm. Another software is Augur, which is a research project at the University of Missouri and the University of Nebraska at Omaha to learn about the metrics and implementing them and having hands-on experience with them, which informs the research there. But then also it's already been used by Twitter and others. We have Cregit, which is a project by Daniel German, very targeted at the Linux kernel for understanding who contributed what, not at the line level like git blame would do, but at the lower level, at the token level. So you can see this variable was introduced by this person. And so if you want to touch it, need background information, you know who to talk to. Mm-hmm. And then we have Prospector, which was donated by Red Hat, which has an interesting the Prospector has an interesting perspective of like saying, hey, these are the metrics I care about. This is how I weight them. And then you get like red, green, yellow for how healthy the project is. So we have these software projects on the one side, and then we have the metric definition work on the other side. And this is done in 5 working groups. The working groups started to focus the conversation, because at first we had just a long laundry list of metrics, and we had I don't remember, really long list of metrics, and it was unmanageable. So we started a working group on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that was an important topic that a lot of people cared about. So we started to have conversations about how do we capture that in metrics. Evolution, at first it was called growth, maturity, decline. Now it's called evolution, to focus on just raw numbers, basically. How is the project evolving? We have the risk working group that looks at license risk, business risk. And then we have a value working group that looks at project velocity, project popularity, labor investment, to understand the communal value of open source communities or projects, the individual value to the contributors, organizational value to companies. And the 5th working group is common metrics that touch on all of these areas, or that just didn't really fit anywhere else. Just basic, what, when, who was involved, types of contributions, activity dates and times, burstiness, time to first response. Those are examples for the common metrics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see. That sounds very interesting, and yeah, I won't blame you for not actually remembering how many of those metrics you had initially, even broken down in the way that you described. They seem quite a lot, and the way that the groups have evolved actually also seems kind of natural, organic, I would say. Whoever is interested in a topic just kind of naturally gravitates towards that, and if you have enough people, you sort of organically break them down in groups as you described. I wonder how these working groups actually work in practice. Well, obviously not so much on the procedural side of things. Let's say I've already seen, if I'm not mistaken, that you have regular meetings of the people who work in the working groups, but I was more wondering about the evolution of the metrics themselves. So just to pick one that caught my attention from the examples that you gave, labor investment. I'm sure there are other metrics that are far more straightforward than this one, like, for example, I don't know, number of contributors or number of commits or what have you. Some things can be rather straightforward, but for something like this, labor investment, I think it's a good example because it sounds abstract enough that I'm kind of guessing it may not even be a metric per se. Maybe it's a KPI, so a synthesis of other metrics. And I'm guessing you have both. Would you like to tell us a little bit more, maybe about this specific one, and using that one as an example, how do you define metrics collectively, I guess?
You're absolutely right. We have different kinds of metrics. Some are like raw numbers, counting number of commits, counting number of issues, counting number of people. And then we have more aggregate metrics, synthesized metrics that are pulling these threads together and taking them to the next level. And this is an example for the labor investment metric. The idea for this metric came from a conference session. We love to run conference sessions where we had a birds of a feather. We said, hey, anyone interested in talking about value metrics, come and talk with us. And one of the participants was sharing how in their company, he had gone and said, okay, on average, when we get a commit or when we write a commit, this is how much it costs us, basically, here's all the money we spent on our engineers, here's the number of commits, issues, pull requests, whatever we do in open source, we divide the number up, and then we get a value for each type of contribution that we as a company make. And then let's turn this around and look at what are the contributions that we get from other companies, from the community. And then we can assign this dollar value to all of these contributions, and we can turn it into a number where we say, hey, we have invested this much money into our open source project. And if we assume that the community has the same rate of, produce cost to produce the contributions, or if we had to produce all of this ourselves, this is what the community saved us. And that was quite interesting, because now they can go back to their managers and say, open source is saving us this much money. And investing in proper community management, investing in being present at conferences, talking to communities, and doing things that are not directly code related now has value, because we can see the return on investment there. And so what happened after this conference, we went back to our regular process of bi-weekly meetings, talking through the GitHub issue tracker. We defined the metric, we wrote it down, what we learned, what we heard, improved it a little bit, and then it went through our review process where we have a public comment period before it entered the official release.
Okay, I see. That's very interesting. And yeah, I'm sure it will become obvious in a bit as we progress through the conversation why that particular metric piqued my interest. Because, well, some of the reason I mentioned already, because it sounded abstract enough. So thanks for providing the background on how it came to be, basically. And one kind of meta question, let's say, that I had was, well, which is also reinforced, let's say, by the background you gave, was how much of the metrics that, how many of the metrics that you use, would you say are actually open source specific versus, well, closed source, let's say, because well, the fact that you do have a community and therefore, in a way, some of the effort is, you can say, outsourced, even though, as you already pointed out, there is a kind of fine balance there, because you may not be paying for the contributions of those people directly by hiring them, but you pay maybe indirectly because, well, you to nurture a community, you have to do things such as going to conferences and producing documentation and so on and so forth. So there is a kind of intangible, let's say, cost and benefit function at play there. So I'm wondering if you have any idea, any insight as to how many of those metrics that you use are, would you say, are specifically, exclusively open source related versus any kind of software, versus how many of those could apply to any kind of software?
It depends on the context here. So if we look at the metrics, many of them apply to open source projects just the same as they would apply to an internal software development team, especially when you do inner source, where you're trying to build a community, break down silos, create a culture of open collaboration within your organization. The metrics are very similar. The thing you want to do first is figure out what are the business goals that you have for your open source engagement, for your inner source projects. Figure out what the business goals are. Then ask questions about what does it take to reach our goal. So if our goal is to grow the community, then we have questions like, how many developers do we have? How many other types of contributors do we have? And then we can go into the metrics. We can say, okay, how many contributors do we have on the commit side? How many people are opening issues and pull requests? And now we can make a good rational argument for why we're looking at these metrics and how that helps us reach our business goal and make decisions for hey, we're not actually there yet. So let's focus our attention here. One example is let's grow our community. How is the contributions from outside being handled? That's the question. And then we can look at the metric for time to first response. How long does it take the core team of the project to respond to people who are making contributions from outside? And we know that if you don't get a response quickly, people just go away. Whereas if you engage them and say, oh, thank you for this issue, what are your thoughts? How can we help you? Then they're more likely to stay engaged and become even more engaged. And so having a difference there where, and this is totally human nature, you like to talk to your friends more than you like to talk to strangers. And so we often find a disparity where the core team reacts quickly to other core team members, and then outsiders are often ignored longer time. So having that transparency helps in both cases, open source and inner source equally.
Okay, I see. And yeah, you also touched on an interesting point there, like for example, how people in general tend to respond faster to people they work with or already know as compared to others, outsiders, let's say. So I wonder how much, that would be something I would call intangible. So I wonder how many of those intangibles did you come across? And I'm guessing probably quite a few of those. And how successful do you feel you have been in capturing those intangibles in the metrics you came up with?
We are still working on capturing all of this. We have only released something like 50 metrics at this point, and every release we keep adding more and more and more because we hear from people and the experiences. I don't have a hard and fast number. The challenge that we as a CHAOSS project are working on right now is how do we inform people who want to do metrics to get started on their metric journey. So that is our current effort to lower that barrier and help everyone who wants to bring transparency to their projects, to have the software, to get started, to know how to interpret the metrics, and then go through this goal question metric approach for deciding on what metrics you want to pay attention to. Because when you deploy any software and start measuring, there is so much data, so many metrics that you could be looking at. And without a strategy and a focus, it's overwhelming. It's like opening a fire hose of data. And so that is where our effort is right now, to help people focus on the metrics that are most relevant to them.
Mm-hmm. By the way, just out of curiosity, have you ever encountered any pushback in what you do? And I'm referring again, especially to the intangibles. So reactions of the type like, oh, we don't actually want to measure things like community engagement or health because that would be, I don't know, industrializing what we feel is, just good work, basically.
We definitely have conversations about how do we measure things without creating an environment that is going against the culture of the community. So when you start measuring, people will start to look at the numbers and you get what you measure. And so there have been examples for, hey, if you review patches, then your reputation in the community increases. And so what would happen is people would wait for an experienced person to review, and then they pile on with their own review, just thumbs up again. And so this kind of gamification of metrics is something we've talked about time and time again. And it just simply requires to be on top of it, to have this reaction from the community, watch it, and then change your metric strategy. The interesting thing is metrics are driven by what I see, two different perspectives. One, we've talked about organizations wanting to have transparency into the projects, foundations wanting to have transparency about how good they are stewarding the projects and showing to their members, hey, we are taking good care of your projects, your contributions are valued. The other side is communities themselves want that transparency as well. Community members like to see, hey, I'm having an impact. Look, I'm on the leaderboard. My contribution matters. And so we see this from both sides. Having these metrics helps the community. There are some other things. Gamification was one where we want to be careful. Another is when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, where we start to deal with personal identifiable information that can be sensitive. Outing someone as being gay and they live in a country or environment where they can be targeted for that. So those are things we are mindful of as we go about this. But our goal as CHAOSS is to say, hey, here are the metrics you can be measured. Careful, here's a place you might want to be more careful about going down, but here are the options.
And just to kind of tie it together, the metrics and the software that you referred to earlier. So, suppose your evangelizing work is successful and you have a new adopter project or a community that comes to you and says, well, okay, we're on board. We're convinced we need to use those metrics. How would they go about adopting them? And I'm guessing they don't have to adopt them wholesale, like all or nothing. They can maybe adopt some. But how would they, for example, actually tie? Suppose they have a GitHub. Suppose they have an online forum or other software that they use to keep track of their activity and potentially also their internal communication, maybe their Jira or other project manager software. So how do they tie these things together to the software that you provide as a project, and how can they use the metrics through that? Do they have dashboards or something?
The first step is to get off zero. You're absolutely right. You cannot look at all of the metrics at once. Start small. An easy way to get started is to use Cauldron. If you go to cauldron.io, it's a free platform. You can type in, here's my GitHub project or organization, then it pulls all of the repositories from that organization. If it's spread out across different repos and organizations, then you can pull all those into a report. It's completely free. It's built on the CHAOSS software, and you can start to have metrics. There's even a tab that has the CHAOSS logo with metrics that we are including in our community health report, which if you don't want to do this yourself, you can go to the CHAOSS website. There is a community health report link, and then you just tell us your information about the project and we send you a PDF with some metrics. So that is the easiest way to get started. And then you look at the metrics. If you have questions, you can come to the CHAOSS community. We have regular meetings, office hours. We have a mailing list. We have a matrix, IRC. I think we're just about to add a Slack channel. And then you can ask questions about, hey, what does this mean? What do you see? And what really matters here is to bring the knowledge that you have about the community in context with the metrics. Because we can look at the metrics and say, oh, it seems to be going down. And then you say, yes, but we actually implemented a new process for code reviews. And so we have fewer commits, but each commit has gone through a more rigorous process. They're a little bit larger. There is more engagement from the community overall. But this one number just happens to go down, but the quality, the engagement, everything else is going up. So it's actually a good thing. So we need to have this context from the community, the understanding of what's happening, and then we pair it with the metrics and we can start to tell a story. And that is how we get started with metrics. You start to tell the story and back it up with metrics. And then once you do that, we can start to add more and more metrics and become more and more sophisticated with that. And then if you want to run your own dashboard, your own platform, you can use any of the software we have in the project and deploy it yourself. Or of course, you can hire Bitergia.
Okay, I see. Right. So this is the part that Vitergia plays into that. I guess you provide support services to projects that want to adopt the methodology, the metrics, the software, and need some help with that.
Correct. Bitergia provides the consultancy around metric strategy, around how do you implement it in your day-to-day processes. We go through the goal question metric approach with our customers. We help with hosting, maintaining, updating, supporting the platform. Bitergia can run reports, say here, you had this question, here's the answer. And that is what Bitergia does as a service on top of the metrics. But the tools being used are the same open source tools you can find in the CHAOSS project.
Yeah, that's a very common model in open source, actually. So it makes sense that you also apply it there. So I mentioned earlier in the conversation that there was a specific thing that led me towards the CHAOSS project, and that was the confluence of two of my interests, let's say. So data analytics, metrics, all of these things, and open source open source projects, and actually also commercial open source. So the trigger for that was well, as I'm sure that you know, and many of the people who listen will know as well, there has been kind of debate going on around commercial open source and specifically open source projects backed by commercial companies. And there was, let's say, mostly with cloud vendors. And the context there is that many of those companies that build the open source software, that actually most of them were started as open source projects. They were successful. A company was built around that to commercialize it, and so they're having trouble with the way cloud vendors use their software. And their claim is that, well, they're not giving enough back, or maybe in some cases they're not giving anything back. There have been a few analyses on that. Mostly, to the best of my knowledge, the analysis that have been done to that day are focused on contributions in terms of code. And they say, for example, the main contributor to the code base of project X is actually the vendor that is built around that project, and the cloud vendors that use that project don't contribute so much. And the counter argument in many cases from the vendors that use the project without actually contributing in terms of code, that, well, yes, but we help spread the adoption of the project, we contribute in terms of community, and so on. And there have been a few ways that companies have reacted to that situation. One way was that some companies basically changed their licenses so that they would discourage or forbid cloud vendors to use their software. Others have said, have suggested actually that, well, maybe there's a better way. Maybe we could actually measure the contributions, not just in terms of code. That much is clear, who contributes what, but actually in terms of value overall. So things like community health, adoption, resolving issues, and all of those things. And it sounds like very, very much in sync with what you're doing. To me, it sounds like, the closest thing, the closest match to implementing something like this proposal, which initially sounds, over ambitious. I think the closest match would be something similar to what you're doing. So I wonder, from where you stand, whether you think this is actually feasible, and whether you've had anyone coming to you and saying, well, hey, we would like to use your metrics, your way of doing things to actually do that, measure value in a holistic way, and actually give credit where credit is due.
There are several conversations going on around this topic because, yeah, it's something that gets a lot of attention in the last couple of years. And one of the places where I've been most involved in this conversation is in the Sustain OSS community, where we talk about the balance between sustaining open source projects and who uses it, who creates it. There are, I think, three perspectives that we need to differentiate here. One is the perspective of the open source project, where as an open source project, because of the open source license, we don't care about users, how many users, where they use it, because the open source definition says we do not discriminate against any users. What we do care about is contributions. And so as an open source project, we want to have transparency in who is contributing, how much is being contributed, how active is the development, where are things being neglected, do we have funding to run the events and do the advertising and whatnot that we want to do as a project. The other two perspectives are the commercial perspectives of companies that heavily do research and development, create an open source project, or heavily invest in an open source project. And then we have the other perspective of users who don't really invest in it. They are the ones using the open source software, and they don't have the expenses of investing and developing open source. And I think Dries Buytaert did a really good job in his blog post on balancing the makers and takers to scale and sustain open source software to explain how this dynamic is shaping up and what this actually means for open source projects. So I recommend the blog post by Dries Buytaert for this. The place metrics come in here is, and this is the conversation that we've had so far, is takers, the companies who use open source software without heavily involved in the development, can use the metrics to see how much value do we get, how much should we give back if they are conscious about this, and having that transparency. And the makers likewise can use the transparency to make a similar assessment with how much are we investing, how much does the community give back to us. With the license change, that is a story, I think, outside of the community, because it's a business interest that is being pursued here. And with regards to how that affects the community, it's really interesting to point the community metrics at the communities and see how has this license change affected the collaboration. I think when we looked at Elasticsearch, a lot of the community or a lot of the development was done by Elastic. And so changing the license, you still have the Elastic employees doing all of the work after that. So at least on the code development side, the majority of the work continued just the same as before. So having those kinds of metrics and insights really helps you to understand what kind of open source project you're looking at and what that community looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that in broad strokes, just black and white thing, that I would classify most open source projects in one of two categories. There are those that are heavily reliant, let's say, kind of built around a single vendor that employs most of the contributors and, organizes events and does all the community outreach. And then there are a few that are more spread out, let's say. So you have more contributors for more organizations. And for the former, as you said, for the example of Elastic, well, maybe changing licenses not doesn't have that much of an impact because most of the contributions were coming from one place anyway. So, but for the latter, that would be different.
Yeah, again, this is where context comes in. And as we are looking at the metrics, we need to know the story of the community, and we can use the metrics to tell the story better and more objectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good takeaway point from all of this, which actually applies in a broader context, not just for open source, but in general. Metrics are good, but to tell a story, you need to know the context. You need to know how to interpret them.
Yes, absolutely.
Great, thank you. It's been really interesting, and thanks again for making the time for the conversation. And if you have any closing thoughts or comments you'd like to share, feel free. Otherwise, thanks again for your time.
Yeah, in closing, if any of the listeners are interested in community metrics, join us at the CHAOSS community, sign up to our mailing list. You can join any of our calls. We are pretty open and friendly, I want to say. So feel free to just drop us a line, listen to our podcast to learn more about how different companies and different users have used metrics and implemented them. There's a great many stories that are worth listening to. And thank you, George, for inviting me on to your podcast. I really appreciate talking with you.
Great, thanks as well. And yeah, I may testify to the fact that yes, you look very friendly indeed. So people should not be afraid to join.
I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you like my work, you can follow Link Data Orchestration on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook.